legislative power that went into effect in that Constitution of 1879. There was also a bent to put what some would call statutory language into the Constitution to make it even more difficult than for the legislature and the governor to operate. There have been a number of calls for constitutional conventions since that time. There have also been several efforts at a constitution revision through commissions. As Jonathan mentioned in his introduction, I served in one from 1994 to 96 that made 35 recommendations as to ways to change the Constitution, and in my view, a number of those are really still applicable. There was a Constitution Revision Commission also that was operable before that. This is just worthy of note because it was in existence from 1964 to 72. So I offer that by way of background to also mention that back in 1993, the Legislative Analyst's Office offered a proposal called Making Government Make Sense. We called it MGMS for short. And I think that that proposal, which basically concluded in looking at the state-local government relationship, we concluded that that system of governments was dysfunctional, that there was no common conception of mission between state government and local government, and there was an incredible amount of finger-pointing between one level of government and the other. And I can tell you from my experience, I think that's gotten worse rather than better since 1993. In that piece, we also recommended a number of constitutional and statutory changes to basically rationalize the system of government in California. And in my own view, many of those recommendations back in 1993, and it is still available on the website, certainly are available. I mean, I think in discussing constitutional conventions or other modes of amending the Constitution, we have to first get some agreement as to what the problem is. Now, Dean Brady enumerated a number of problems in California. I think in many respects I would agree certainly with the political polarization that he mentioned. I would say that that starts right away. Members, for example, who are elected to the Senate or the Assembly do not wait until the year before they're going to be out, but actually start right away with term limits in order to decide where their next opportunity is going to be. I think there's also a lack of public trust and civic engagement that underlies the discussion and needs to be put on the table. Dean Brady also mentioned the structural budget problem, which I would agree. And I think the initiative process has served to tie the state into knots. It was actually designed initially to break the hold of Southern Pacific Railroad and the railroad industry on California, and I would submit it's now captive of other special interests. Just to give you a case in point, Dean Brady mentioned some of what he called constrained spending. I would call it instead locked-in spending, in that the locked-in spending has to be handled first before the legislature can make any other changes. Prop 98 is one of those that he already mentioned. There's Proposition 42 back in 2002 that took the sales tax on gasoline that had funded general fund programs and devoted it instead to transportation. Proposition 49 that was sponsored by the governor before he was elected that earmarked $550 million only for after-school programs. And then a series of Proposition 1As that basically locked in the revenue structure of local government in 2004 and then made this gasoline sales tax that I mentioned before, again, locked in 2006. But in addition to locked-in spending, we have locked out revenue. And I think that's important to mention. Proposition 99 in 1988 locked out $300 million. Proposition 172 in 1993, $3 billion. Proposition 10 in 1998, $600 million. And Proposition 63, as recently as 2004, locked out about $1 billion. So the dynamics affecting the state budget would be very different in many cases if it were not for these propositions. There's also, when we look at the structural part of the budget, longer-term budgeting fiscal liabilities that haven't been addressed and I think are one of the key problems. Well, what do we do? I think that's the key question for the discussion today. Myself, in looking at the political polarization, I have serious reservations about a convention at this time. I think that it would make, the polarization makes consensus difficult and very hard then to sell to the electorate what the results of the convention would be. I would tend to favor a more targeted amendment approach I think it would have a greater likelihood of success. But what I think is key in so doing is to be sure that you're addressing the underlying problems by the types of amendments that actually are considered and packaged for the electorate's consideration. I would note that some efforts are already underway. For example, the voters passed Proposition 11 related to redistricting. I think Dean Brady mentioned the polarization in the primaries. I would certainly agree. And so Proposition 11 will be applicable after the 2010 census. You also will have the opportunity to vote on an open primary in this June election. An open primary, again, would tend to bring more people to the middle, and I think that's an important consideration. I do think that some of the changes clearly have to be initiated from the outside, whether it's legislative reforms of term limits, campaign finance, initiative process, or the like would be not trusted if they were to come from the legislative arena. I do feel there's a lack of political courage currently to be transparent and direct with Californians about what their government is doing and the sacrifice that will be required to get our fiscal house and our governmental system in order. Thank you very much.
I'm going to start off with two apologies. One, I'm going to have to leave this event early, so unless the organizers have me take a couple questions when I'm done, I'll probably have to leave right after John's presentation. The other apology is during the intro it was mentioned that I am from the dark side, and I'm sorry that I root for the other football team, especially this week, so I've already said the worst thing I can say to this group. But on the positive side, my wife is a graduate of the Goldman School, and we have one of those flags we put outside our house. I'm beginning a house divided, so part of the family is over there. But I do, Liz was mentioning her disclaimers. I'm speaking from many different hats today in my brief presentation. As mentioned, I'm a lecturer here at Berkeley, and I teach California politics to undergraduates. I'm a school board member. I run Children Now, which is a children's advocacy group where we're trying to ensure that every single child in this state has the opportunity to reach their full potential. And I'm a lifelong Californian, and I have a 13, 11, and 7-year-old. So I'm very, very concerned about the future of this state, which is actually the main theme I want to talk about, and I'll close with today. Unlike the federal budget, and unlike a local government budget, the California state budget is the budget that is, or is not, as the case may be, funding our future. Because even with the changes that Dean Brady mentioned and the decreases in higher ed, still more than half of the state budget is geared towards education and youth. This is a children's budget. Compare that with the local city government budget, county government, or federal government. So it's the state government budget that, if you, like most human beings, exists in large part to think about the future and making life better for our kids, that is the most important budget and is the budget most in turmoil, which is why I'm thrilled that John and all of us, and you're here, because fixing California state budget, I would argue, is the most important thing we can do as a state. So before I touch very briefly back on that future, I just want to rattle off a few points why I personally support the Constitutional Convention, as long as all the safety provisions that you can ask John about are truly in there. So that's a big assumption, but assuming all that, I'm for it, because I think Liz and Henry rattled off a lot of the issues I was going to rattle off that need changing, but there are a number of them. And yes, we have done redistricting reform, and hopefully that will work. I served in the legislature during a time when the courts had done the redistricting and it was, quote, more fair, and you saw the difference. So that will help, but we